I just love the title for tonight's class and the picture that was created for it. When I was just a young child, my mom, a very avid Bible reader, liked to use this concept to explain to others the idea of the devil. And she would tell visitors that came to our house to talk about the Bible that we had a picture of the devil hanging in our bathroom. And I think somewhat surprised, they'd head down the hallway to look, perhaps intrigued to find out what the devil really looked like. And it would take them a few seconds to realize what she meant, because the only thing hanging on the wall in our bathroom was a mirror, and they would see themselves looking back. And even though that statement's, a little humorous, it does a great job of describing the truth of the matter. Because you see, the devil in the Bible is really a simple concept. It basically refers to sin and our human nature. And so when you look in a mirror, the devil's staring back at you. It's that tendency that every one of us has inside us that's prone to sin and to do the wrong thing. And I just love in the picture there, that sly face that's looking back. You're wanting to do the right thing, but sometimes your human nature wants you to do the wrong thing. And we want to overcome that, don't we? So we learn from the Bible that when we're tempted and when we sin, there's no one that we can blame other than ourselves, because temptation comes from inside. And scripturally, there's no supernatural being that's pushing us to sin against God. Now, that might sound like a bold statement, and we need to step back. And I want to explain to you a very important overriding Bible principle. And it's the one that makes me absolutely certain that the Bible doesn't teach an existence of a supernatural being called the devil. And it all relates to last week's topic, really, about the character of God, because God, we learned, is all powerful. He's eternal, he's immortal, and in fact, he's totally unique. There's this verse from Isaiah chapter 44. And the first thing you'll notice about this verse is that these are the words of God. And God of Israel, the God of Israel, is comparing himself to all the imaginary gods of the other nations, because the Canaanites had their gods and the Babylonians had their gods. And God's saying, look, I am the first and the last. I am eternal. I have no beginning. I have no end. And then he makes a clear statement that apart from himself, no other gods exist. And just to bring that point, home a little bit stronger, in verse 8, just a couple verses later, he says, yea, there is no God, I know not any. And that word for God there is the Hebrew word for power or authority. There's no other God means that there's no other power or authority like God himself. Think of the nations who believed in their gods. They were only imaginary gods. They were their idols. Now, the nations didn't believe that. They believed in their gods, and they denied the God of Israel. They believed he didn't have any power. They essentially took the power away from the God of Israel and ascribed it to their own gods. So the Canaanites said their God was Baal, and the Babylonians had Marduk. But God says he's the only power in the universe. And what I would like to suggest to you is that those who believe in a supernatural devil are doing the same thing that those nations around Israel did. They're taking the power away from God, and they're making another being the power of sin and evil. And in fact, the majority end up fearing a supernatural devil more than they fear the God of Israel or the God and creator of all things. I want to show you another verse from the book of Deuteronomy, and we get the same message that we saw in Isaiah. If you read it carefully, you'll see that God is telling us there's only one God, there's only one power and authority. But what I find helpful in this verse is that God clarifies that he is the God in both heaven and on earth. Because I've heard some say, and maybe argue, yet yes, God is all powerful. He's the God of heaven. But at the same time, they claim there's another God, the God of this world, the God of the earth. But you see what this verse says? It says that the God of Israel is the God of the whole universe, both in heaven and on earth. Now you might be thinking, okay, I understand the power of God, but where does evil come from? There must be some power out there that's the source of evil and wicked things that happen. Well, what does the Bible have to say about that? Now, it might be hard to wrap your head around this, but God has control over evil as much as he does over good. Remember the statement that God is all powerful. And like a parent, sometimes God has to exercise judgment and correction. There's another verse back in Isaiah, just the chapter after the first one that we looked at. And you can see here in verse 6 of Isaiah 45 that God repeats the same thing. He tells us that he's the only God. And then in the next verse, it's as if he anticipates our question. God says, I form the light and create darkness. And think about it. We wouldn't understand the power of light if we didn't know what darkness was. We wouldn't understand the benefits of light if we hadn't experienced true darkness. Well, it's kind of like that with good and evil. And so God goes on to say, I make peace and create evil. Now, isn't that interesting? And when you read the Bible, there's hundreds of verses that indicate that God is a God of judgment. He'll bring evil or judgment upon a person or a nation because he wants to change their course of action, just like a parent wants to direct their child in the right direction. And that's not to say that God is the source of all evil. When you think about it, men and women are pretty good at causing evil themselves. The sin comes from us, but God allows evil to happen and sometimes even directs it in order to fulfill his purpose. And I think what's wrong is when we believe that there's a God of evil, when we take away the power from God and ascribe it to a supernatural being that God, assumably, is incapable of controlling, or that God is allowing to wreak havoc upon his creation. What I'm trying to do is anticipate what you might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, if there's no supernatural being that is causing sin and evil, what is the Bible talking about when it speaks about the devil? Well, it's a very good question. And as you can imagine, it's one that we can only scratch the surface of in our class this evening. But I think we should start in the Old Testament. Did you know that the word devil doesn't appear even a single time in the Old Testament? I was pretty sure that was the case, but I pulled out my search concordance on my Bible program, and I performed a search on the King James Version, and the word devil doesn't show up. Interestingly, the plural form shows up twice, devils plural. And both times it refers to false idols. In other words, the gods of the nation that we were talking about, that God said that they don't exist. Look at this in Deuteronomy 32. It's talking about the Israelites, who God said would turn after the gods of the Canaanites and the other nations around them. They would provoke him to jealousy by worshiping other gods. And he says in verse 17 of Deuteronomy 32, they sacrificed unto devils. That's one of two times devils shows up in the Old Testament. And he says, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. And as we were told in Isaiah, gods that don't really exist. And you see, the reason the word devil doesn't show up in the Old Testament is that the Jews had no concept of a supernatural devil. And why that's important is that we believe that the message of the Bible is consistent from Old to New Testament, from Genesis to Revelation. And every doctrine that we hold to should be visible in both the Old and the New Testament. So why is it that we have no mention of the supernatural devil in the Old Testament? Well, I think it's because it's not a Bible teaching as you know, the world around us believes. Let me take you to another section. So we're going to go into the New Testament because, you know, the concept of the devil is very prevalent in the New Testament. You come across the word devil over 110 times if we include the plural forms of the word. Now, I thought it was helpful that in our introduction tonight in the Bible Facts, it was talking about the languages of the Bible. And we need to remember that the New Testament wasn't written in English originally. It was written in Greek. And you know what? The Greeks had a very common word that they used all the time that was commonly translated in our Bible devil in the English. And that word I have on the screen for you, it's the Greek word diabolos. Think of diabolical. Think of someone that is diabolical and the evil thoughts that they have. That's what we think of with the word, and that's the root of the word. Now, what's interesting is that Greek word diabolos was never intended to refer to a supernatural devil. It became connected with that concept when others introduced that idea, but it had a rather simple meaning. At its most basic level, the word diabolos means a false accuser, someone that speaks falsely or tells lies. And so when the Bible was translated, the translators had to choose how to represent that word in English. And they used different words in different passages. Well, here's a very interesting passage that you might have been reading on the screen in 1 Timothy chapter 3. And the challenge is to look at that passage and think, what word would be the Greek word diabolos, remembering that the word means false accuser. Well, if you read through it, you'll realize that the word that is translated from diabolos into English is the word slanderer. Now, what's being described of a slanderer in this passage? Well, there was a principle in the first century churches that the leaders had to have good qualities, good characteristics, not only them, but their families and their wives as well. So the deacons, the leaders of the church, would be disqualified from service if they or their wives were slanderers. Or we could use the word devils if they were false accusers, if they were people that told lies. They would be rejected from service. And that was the meaning of the word. It was the everyday word that someone used for those who told lies or were slanderers. It could refer to individuals. It could refer to a worldly power. It could refer to the tendency of our own human nature, which tries to tell us lies at times. Well, there's another passage I want to share with you from the Gospel of John, because here the word diabolos appears again. And Jesus says, I have 12 disciples. He's talking to the 12 disciples. And one of those disciples was going to betray him. And Jesus says to them, one of you is a devil. So that's the Greek word diabolos. Well, who was that disciple? We know it was Judas Iscariot. It actually says that in the next verse. It says, he spake of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for he it was that should betray him, being one of the 12. Now, you'll remember the story. Judas was a faithful disciple, one of Jesus' closest friends, but he allowed his doubts about Jesus to take over. He became more interested in money than he was in Jesus' teaching. And eventually, he decided to betray his master for the promise of riches. And Jesus wasn't suggesting that Judas was a supernatural devil. He was his friend. Jesus wasn't implying that Judas was influenced by a devil. Jesus was calling Judas a false accuser. By his actions, he was going to say things that were false about Jesus and betray him to the Jewish authorities. Well, it's very interesting once we understand that key to understanding this topic. And I think it's useful to consider for a moment what the Greek word diabolos is used to refer to in the New Testament. And you do this by looking up in a concordance the words and following the passages. And this is what you'll find that the word diabolos refers to. It refers to slanderers, like those that couldn't serve as leaders in the first century churches. It refers to rebellious men, like Judas, who turned against Christ. There's a very fascinating one in the book of 1 Peter. And it was actually referring to the Roman Emperor Nero. You might remember Nero. He was fond of persecuting Christians. And how did he do that? He would feed the Christians, among other things, to the lions. And so in 1 Peter chapter 5, it says, your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. That was Nero. He was a slanderer. He said false things about those that were serving Christ. It refers to Cain from the Old Testament, Cain and Abel, Cain who killed his brother and by his actions spoke falsely against Abel. It refers to false religion, religions that tell lies about God and about his character. It refers to sin. And ultimately, it refers to our human nature. So when you're reading the Bible and you come across the word devil, think about these concepts. Think about the language that was used in the day. and realize that because the Bible can't speak about a supernatural devil because God is all powerful, think about which one of these concepts might fit the context. That's going to be a key that's going to help you understand this sometimes confusing topic. You'll find that one of these concepts fits every passage that you come across. And at the root of all these concepts is the human nature that you and I possess. Just like my mom taught, there is no one that we can blame for our sins or our temptations. We've got to look in the mirror and take control of our own lives. Well, I can't finish without taking you to one last verse, and it's from the Epistle of James in the New Testament. You see, what the Bible ultimately teaches us is that we have to take responsibility for our sin. Look what it says here in James chapter 1. Every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Where does sin and temptation comes from? Well, it comes from inside. And James goes on to tell us that it leads to death. And really, it's incumbent upon every one of us to take a good, hard look in the mirror and choose not to give into those temptations, but choose to serve God and put him first in our lives. All right, Kevin, I'll turn it back to you.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to go to our website to find other Bible study materials, and also don't forget to take the quiz by using the link down below. If you take enough quizzes, you'll earn some awesome rewards, as well as some very useful Bible study tools. We at Bible Basics Webinar also specialize in individual and small group Bible studies. You can text us by using the phone number that's also down in the description, as well as our email to get more information about our Zoom and in-person classes. And of course, thank you so much for watching Bible Basics Webinar, where we use the Bible to learn about